Hello, this is Elizabeth Chu, the CEO of the South Carolina Historical Society. Welcome to From the Vault, the South Carolina Historical Society podcast, created and hosted by my colleague Sydney Derrick, our librarian. This podcast will demystify archives. I am passionate about convincing people that archives are not in any way boring. They are, in fact, incredibly interesting. Who doesn't like to read stories about other people? Imagine spending all day long in a library reading someone else's diary. That is what historians and people who use archives do every day. From the Vault, we'll be telling stories of all South Carolinians from the perspective of the many fascinating items in our large and important archival collections.
Hello and welcome to our podcast. As you just heard from Elizabeth, I'm Sydney Derrick, librarian here at the South Carolina Historical Society. In this episode, we're discussing a woman who played a role in colonial South Carolina and Georgia as peacemaker, translator, and liaison to Native Americans, specifically those in the Creek Nation. Within the South Carolina Historical Society archives is a plat showing land in Colleton County near the Edisto River, which had previously been owned by John Musgrove Jr. John inherited the land from his father, and in 1731, John sold the land to the Champneys. Now, what we know from information found elsewhere is by that time, the time he sold that land, he was married to a woman named Mary. And Mary Musgrove is who we're talking about today. So in addition to this plat, our sources for this episode are The Life and Times of Mary Musgrove by Stephen C. Hahn, Memorial of Mrs. Mary Bosomworth to Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Heron, held by the National Archives in London and accessed through Colonial America, a digital exhibit from Adam Matthew, the South Carolina Encyclopedia entry for Mary Musgrove, South Carolina A to Z by South Carolina Public Radio, Indians of the South Carolina Low Country, 1562 to 1751 by Jean Waddell, and South Carolina Indians, Indian Traders, and Other Ethnic Connections beginning in 1670 by Teresa M. Hicks and West Hawkesbury. Mary was born around the year 1700 in what is today Georgia, in Coweta in the Creek Nation. Her mother was Creek, and her father was a white man who traded with the Native Americans. Most works about her say that her father's name was Edward Griffin, who was a trader based here in Charleston. According to Mary's own words, her mother's family were leaders of the Creek people, and many sources identify her as a niece or a great-niece of the chief. Until the age of 7, she lived with her mother and the Creek people, but at that age, her father brought her to Pompon in South Carolina. Now, Pompon was the name used for today's Edisto River, and it was the name of a settlement near the river in Colleton County within St. Bartholomew's Parish, which had been formed just before Mary's arrival there. We don't know why she was brought there by her father. That's a little unclear in her history, but what we do know is that once she arrived there, she was baptized and she received an English-style education for about 8 years until the Yamasee War. At that point, around 1715, she moved back with the people of the Creek Nation, and that is where she met John Musgrove Jr., her future husband. Like her, John had a Native American mother and a white father, and his father had been sent by the government of South Carolina to broker a treaty of peace with the Creek people. So that's why he was there. After they married, John and Mary moved back to South Carolina to the land that John had inherited from his father in Colleton County. And they lived there for about 7 years, according to Mary. And a lot of this information that I'm attributing to Mary comes from a memorial that she wrote and delivered, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. But it told the story of her life. And in this memorial, which she wrote as an adult, she was asking about the payment and the property that she was promised by members of the royal government. The couple, they eventually moved to Yamacraw Bluff at the request of the leaders of the Creek Nation. So this was an area just across the Savannah River from South Carolina, near today's city of Savannah in Georgia. In John's father's previous negotiations with the Creek Nation on behalf of the South Carolina government, this river, the Savannah River, was set as the boundary between the colony of South Carolina and the Native American land. So in Yamacraw Bluff, the couple they set up a successful trading post, and they facilitated the trade of goods between the Creek people and the merchants and traders from Charlestown in South Carolina. At this point, just in case you're wondering about the timeline here, Georgia was not a colony yet. It was just about to be set up as one. So that's where we are. While she was in Yamacraw Bluff, Mary was not only a successful merchant, she also soon became useful for the royal government, who at this time was creating a colony there in Georgia. And she was specifically useful to one of the founders of Georgia, James Oglethorpe. He arrived in Yamacraw Bluff in 1733, and his goal was to establish an English colony. Mary was already close with Yamacraw leader Tomochichi, and she was fluent in the English language as well as their customs because she had spent more than half of her childhood living with English settlers in South Carolina. Plus, as I mentioned earlier, she was close family to the leaders of the Creek people, which gave her influence there. So because of all of this, she was able to serve as interpreter and mediator between Tomochichi and Oglethorpe, and she also became a consultant for Oglethorpe. According to Mary, the Creek people were a little bit weary of him and the English when they first arrived and threatened to wage war against them because they saw them as invaders, breaching the peace treaty that had been settled between them and the government of South Carolina. Mary, however, was able to mediate and broker a new treaty between the Creek people and Oglethorpe on behalf of the English king. And after the treaty was signed by the local Creek leaders, Mary then had to convince the leaders of the entire Creek nation as a whole to approve and sign, which she was able to do. And this staved off a war between the Creeks and these English people coming to settle a colony there. The peace in Mary's life, however, would soon come to an end. John and Mary had firmly established themselves in Yamacraw, selling off John's land in Colleton County and moving all of their horses, cattle, and possessions into their new home. It was Creek Nation territory when they moved there, and that move came at the request of the Creek leaders. Don't forget about that. And in big part because of Mary's efforts, the English were able to settle and begin a new colony, Georgia. According to Mary, she and John also extended credit to the Englishmen coming to establish Georgia at their trading post so that they could create this new settlement. But according to her again, they were never repaid by these men. She also claims that she encouraged the men of the Creek Nation to help protect this fledgling colony of the king and to also help protect the southern parts of South Carolina from foreign invaders and other not-so-friendly Native American groups, rather to use their skills hunting for her trading post to increase her wealth because she thought that was the right thing to do. So in her claims, she made a sacrifice of her own business in order to protect the people of these English colonies. Her own brother actually even died in service to the king at the Siege of St. Augustine in 1740, when Oglethorpe and the British, retaliating on a Spanish attack on them, tried to take control of St. Augustine. However, that ultimately failed. But throughout the next several years, Mary continued to work with Oglethorpe and the British, acting as ambassador to many Native American groups, which meant she was traveling to other areas of the colony. And as she explained later, she was leaving her home for months at a time, which left all of her properties neglected. And because of all of these factors combined, she says, that led to the ruin of her trading post and the debt she eventually found herself in. In the midst of all of this, her husband, John Musgrove, died. Now, she did remarry soon after, which some historians say is because she had no living sons, and she stood to lose her property unless she was married. So her second husband was Jacob Matthews, who may have been her former indentured servant. By this time, her trading post had moved further south at Oglethorpe's request to the banks of the Altamaha River. This is where her second husband grew ill, and she then traveled back with him to Yamakra, where he died. In her absence from this new trading post on the Altamaha River, she says it was destroyed by enemy Native Americans who burned it down and even murdered some of the people there. In 1743, 10 years after he first arrived, James Oglethorpe left Georgia for England, never to return to the colony. But before he sailed, he paid Mary £200 for her interpretive and mediation services to the crown, but he also promised to reimburse her for the losses of property she suffered and to petition the royal government to pay her more money. Spoiler alert, Oglethorpe did not follow through. Meanwhile, Mary eventually married a third time to a minister, Reverend Thomas Bosomworth. And by this time, she was also actively fighting for her payment, for the payment that she felt that she was owed by the British Crown. And so her new husband joined her in that fight. But she wasn't just fighting for money. The land that she claimed was hers had been taken from her, declared by the English to not be hers at all. It was land on the coast of Georgia that the Creek Nation had given to her in a ceremony that was attended by colony officials, perhaps on purpose to make sure they were witness to it, but she did not have the official title to it from the colony's English government. At the time of that ceremony in 1738, the British had only had an established settlement there for about 5 years, and officials were reluctant to grant her the land title, so they just didn't. They just kept putting it off. In order to have papers proclaiming the land hers, Mary had planned to travel to England to plead her case in person. On the way, though, she was once again pulled into helping the English, this time here in South Carolina. Her travels were derailed when, in 1752, South Carolina's governor, James Glenn, asked her to return to her old job and intervene as a mediator to stop a war between the Creek and Cherokee peoples, which was affecting the economy and welfare of this colony of South Carolina. When Mary stepped in, a group of Creek people led by a leader named Acorn Whistler had already killed 4 Cherokee delegates who were on their way to negotiations in Charleston about this conflict. To maintain peace, Mary determined that an act of justice was necessary and convinced Acorn Whistler's tribesmen to kill him. Mary successfully sold this idea to the rest of the Creek people, and by this, she was able to pacify the Cherokee. For this mediation, Governor Glenn had promised Mary payment, which she was in desperate need of. But it was the second time a government official representing the crown did not follow through for Mary. No money was given to Mary, although the South Carolina legislature did award her land back in Colleton County, and Governor Glenn promised to back Mary's claims for her lands in the neighboring colony of Georgia. 5 years later, skipping ahead a little bit, Mary was still fighting for her property when once again her services were needed. The governor of Georgia, Henry Ellis, was worried about an attack by the people of the Creek Nation, and he knew that Mary was a skilled negotiator. So for her help in quelling a war, he made a deal with her. She gave up her claims to most of the land that she was given by her people, but she was able to keep what is today's St. Catherine's Island off the coast of Georgia, as well as several thousand pounds. So Mary moved to the island in 1759 and lived there with her third husband, the Reverend, until her death, which was probably in 1765, just 6 years later. Mary had no children who survived into adulthood. After her death, her husband later remarried and did eventually sell the land that Mary fought so hard for. So that is the story of Mary Musgrove Matthews Bosomworth, who spent a lot of her life in between 2 nations, in between 2 peoples, and was called upon quite often throughout her life to keep the peace between those 2 nations. And it's the story of a woman living in colonial America under British rule who was able to carve out a name and a reputation for herself, albeit having to rely on the men around her either for marriage or for help getting the money that she was promised by government officials for services that they asked her to perform. So that's going to do it for us this month. We'll see you back here next month. Thanks so much, and we'll see you then.